Fluorescent lights hummed with a frequency matching the throbbing in my palm. I sat on the crinkly paper, clutching a blood-soaked rag. My cheating wife and her millionaire boyfriend got me fired from my engineering job. Enjoy poverty, she texted. At 38, working as a janitor. I cut my hand and went to the ER. The doctor examined my blood work and went silent. He called in 3 specialists. Sir, your DNA shows something impossible. You are related to... What he said made the room spin. 20 minutes earlier, I was invisible. I was just the guy in the gray uniform, pushing a yellow mop bucket. A light fixture in the supply closet had burned out. It was a simple task to replace it, but my hands were slippery with cheap soap and exhaustion. The bulb shattered in my grip. Glass sliced through my palm like a shark's tooth, severing skin and scraping bone. I didn't scream. I just stared at the red river mapping lines across my lifeline, dripping onto my boots. A nurse found me wrapping the wound with paper towels. She checked my uniform before my face, her expression shifting from concern to professional detachment. But she rushed me downstairs, but I felt the weight of the eyes in the waiting room. They saw the name stitched on my chest and the stains on my pants. I was debris to be cleared away, a problem to be stitched up and sent back to the basement. I held my injured hand tight, shame burning hotter than the cut. Dr. Thorne was young, tired, and efficient. He didn't ask how I lost my job or why a structural engineer was changing light bulbs at 2 in the morning. He just numbed the area and started sewing. The tug of the thread against my skin was a bizarre, dull sensation. Standard procedure to run a blood panel. He mumbled, barely making eye contact. I nodded, watching my blood fill 3 small vials. I expected him to find anemia or malnutrition, the physical receipts of my crushing poverty. He left to process the samples, while a nurse bandaged my hand. The silence in the room stretched thin. I closed my eyes, calculating how many hours of overtime I would need to pay for this visit. Then the door opened. Dr. Thorne walked back in, but his efficiency was gone. He was pale, holding a tablet with white, knuckled intensity. He didn't look at my hand anymore. He looked at me with a terrifying focus that made the hair on my arms stand up. He didn't speak. Instead, he stepped aside as 2 other physicians entered the cramped cubicle. One was older, wearing the long white coat of a department head. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with static electricity. They surrounded the bed, ignoring the uniform and the dirt under my fingernails. They weren't looking at a transient worker anymore. They were looking at a biological anomaly. They were looking at me, like I was a ghost who had just walked out of a grave. 3 months before the blood hit the floor, I was standing in a corner office overlooking the Schuylkill River. I was a senior structural engineer, earning over $200,000 a year. My name was on the blueprints for the city's newest suspension bridge. I wore tailored suits, not gray polyester. I had a wife named Vanessa who kissed me at the door and told me we were building an empire. I believed her because I was building skyscrapers. I didn't see the demolition charges she had already planted at the foundation. Vanessa had an appetite that my salary couldn't quite satisfy. She wanted the penthouse, not the loft. She wanted summers in Monaco, not weekends at the shore. She started mentioning a client named Victor Holbrook. Victor was a tech investor with a $60 million yacht and a smile that looked like a predator assessing a wounded deer. I dismissed him as a harmless business contact. I trusted Vanessa because trust is the mortar that holds a marriage together. I didn't know the mortar was turning into sand. The collapse happened on a Tuesday. I came home early with a migraine that felt like a drill bit behind my eyes. The house was quiet, smelling of her expensive lily perfume. I walked up the stairs, loosening my tie, needing darkness and silence. Then I heard her laugh. It wasn't the polite laugh she gave my jokes at dinner parties. It was low, throaty, and cruel. I stopped outside the bedroom door. "He has no idea," she said. "He thinks his little blueprints actually matter." I pushed the door open. Vanessa was lounging on the bed in a silk robe I had bought her for our anniversary. She held the phone to her ear, her eyes locking onto mine with zero panic. She didn't hang up. She didn't scramble to cover herself. She just said, "I have to go, Victor. He's home early." She set the phone on the nightstand like she was putting down a coaster. "You are ruining my call, Wayne," she said. Her calmness was more violent than a scream. "Who is he?" I asked, my voice sounding hollow in the expensive room. She stood up and walked to her closet. "Victor is an upgrade, Wayne. He's worth $600 million. He takes me to places where people actually matter." She pulled a suitcase down from the shelf. "I am 34. I don't have time to wait for you to become rich." She looked at me like I was a terrifyingly bad investment she was finally dumping. "I filed the papers this morning. Victor is sending a car." I thought the divorce was the bottom, but Victor wasn't finished. He wanted to ensure I couldn't fight back. 2 days later, my boss called me into his office. He wouldn't look me in the eye. "We have to let you go," he mumbled. "Client pressure." Victor had leveraged his investments to force my firm's hand. I applied to 10 other firms that week. All of them rejected me within hours. I was blacklisted. My reputation was torched. I was radioactive in a town I helped build. My savings evaporated in legal fees fighting a battle I couldn't win. The bank took the house. The lease took the car. I sold my watch to pay for a motel room that smelled like stale smoke. When the money ran out completely, I took the only job that didn't ask questions. I put on the gray uniform and picked up a mop. I disappeared into the service elevators. I didn't just lose my wife or my career. I lost my name, my dignity, and my future. The transition from suburbia to survival was a blur of transactions I regretted instantly. I pawned my Rolex for a fraction of its value, watching the broker weigh the gold like he was buying meat. I sold the Audi to a dealership that asked no questions, but offered insulting cash. My tailored suits went to a consignment shop. With every sale, I felt lighter, but it was the weightlessness of a man falling from a great height. I packed what remained into 2 duffel bags. My new kingdom was a studio apartment in Kensington with bars on the windows and a lock that rattled when the wind blew. The ceiling was a topographical map of water stains, brown and peeling. At night, slept the street outscreamed with sirens and arguments that sounded like they were happening in my kitchen. I learned to sleep with a pillow pressed over my ears. I learned that silence was a luxury item I could no longer afford. Fear became my new roommate. Rejection emails stopped coming because I stopped applying. Hunger has a way of silencing pride very quickly. I took the night shift at Philadelphia General, the same hospital where my mother had nursed for 30 years. She used to walk these halls as a hero. I walked them as a shadow. I pulled my cap low and kept my eyes on the linoleum tiles. I wasn't Wayne the engineer anymore. I was just the guy who emptied the red biohazard bins. Invisibility takes practice. You learn to make yourself small against the walls when doctors rush past. You learn to time your breathing so it doesn't draw attention. I saw former colleagues once, consulting on a structural expansion for the East Wing. I dove into a supply closet and held the door shut, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. They laughed about something in the hallway. I stood in the dark, smelling bleach and hating my own cowardice. The text arrived at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was on my knees in a public restroom, scrubbing graffiti off a stall door. My phone vibrated against my thigh, a buzz that felt like an intrusion from another planet. I dried my hands and checked the screen. It was a photo. Vanessa stood on the deck of a yacht, holding a champagne flute against a turquoise sky. She looked radiant, expensive, and completely untouched by guilt. The caption was 2 words: "Enjoy poverty." I read it 3 times. I didn't cry. I didn't throw the phone against the tiled wall. Something inside me simply clicked off. It was the sound of the last structural support giving way. But the building didn't fall. It hardened. I realized then that I wasn't suicidal. I was just cracked. A cracked beam can still hold weight, if the load is balanced right. I saved the photo. It wasn't a memory anymore. It was fuel. I put the phone back in my pocket and picked up the scrub brush. The motion was mechanical, rhythm replacing rage. I cleaned the rest of the graffiti until the stall door was pristine. I finished my shift, clocked out, and walked back to the studio apartment with the rattling lock. I stared at the ceiling stains and waited for the next night to start. I didn't know that 3 days later, a light bulb would shatter and change the world. The silence in the room wasn't medical, it was reverent. The department head, a woman with steel, gray hair and sharp eyes, stepped closer to the bed. She didn't look at my bandaged hand. She looked at my face like she was trying to solve a riddle on my skin. "Mr. Wayne," Dr. Thorne said, his voice trembling slightly. "We need to ask you a question that might seem unrelated to your injury." My stomach dropped. I braced myself for a diagnosis of something fatal. "Was your father adopted?" The question hit me like a physical blow. It was so specific, so random. "Yes," I stammered, gripping the bed railing. "In 1952. He never knew his parents. He died 10 years ago." The doctors exchanged a look that screamed confirmation. The older woman pulled up a chair and sat down, ignoring the grime on my uniform. "Your blood work triggered a flag in our database," she said. "A marker we haven't seen in decades. There is a specific genetic anomaly." She continued, her voice intense. "It is unique to one family line in Pennsylvania history. We verify it because this hospital was built by their donations." She paused, letting the words hang in the antiseptic air. "You carry the biological marker of the Thornwood family." The name meant nothing to me at first. Then it clicked. Steel mills. Skyscrapers. A dynasty that owned half the state. "That's impossible," I whispered. "My dad was a mill worker." Elliot Thornwood had a son named Franklin who died young. Dr. Thorne interjected, stepping forward. "But rumors always existed of a child born out of wedlock in 1950, too. A child given up to protect the family reputation." He tapped the tablet screen hard. "The DNA is conclusive, sir. You are the direct biological grandson of Elliot Thornwood." The room seemed to tilt. My father, the man who brown bagged his lunch every day, was the secret heir to an industrial empire. Elliot passed away 2 months ago at 94. The department head said softly. "The news has been dominated by the succession crisis. There are no known heirs. The estate was set to be dissolved into trusts." She leaned in closer, her eyes wide. "But the will is explicit. If a biological descendant exists, they inherit the controlling interest." I looked at my hands. Rough, calloused, stained with soap. These were the hands of a janitor, but the blood inside them was apparently royalty. What are we talking about? I asked, my voice cracking. A few million. Dr. Thorne actually laughed. A nervous, jagged sound. Sir, the Thornwood estate includes holdings in steel, real estate, and tech. He looked at the senior doctor for permission, then back at me. The current valuation is approximately $9.4 billion. The number didn't compute. It was too big to be real money. It was a GDP. It was a weapon. It was enough to buy the world. My stitches throbbed in time with my racing heart. 3 months ago, my wife left me for a man with 60 million. She told me to enjoy poverty. Now, I was staring at a doctor telling me I could buy Victor Holbrook's life 100 times over. I tried to stand up, but my knees buckled. Dr. Thorne caught me by the arm. Careful, Mr. Thornwood, he said. He didn't call me Wayne. He used the name that changed everything. The next 2 weeks were a blur of suits and saliva swabs. The Thornwood Foundation's lawyers tried to fight it initially. They claimed fraud, contamination, and coincidence. But 3 independent labs confirmed the match. My father was the lost son, and I was the surviving grandson. I sat in a mahogany boardroom that smelled of lemon polish and old money. A lawyer named Sterling slid a stack of documents across the table. Sign here. Mr. Thornwood, he said. The pen felt heavier than my mop. I signed my name 16 times. With every signature, the life I knew evaporated a little more. The debt collectors, the eviction notices, the hunger pangs. They were being erased by ink, on heavy bond paper. Sterling watched me with a mix of respect and fear. He knew the power was shifting. When I finished, he handed me a black debit card and a secure phone. The initial liquid assets are available immediately, he said. The rest will clear within 48 hours. I walked out of the skyscraper and sat on a cold stone bench. Traffic roared past, oblivious to the bomb that had just gone off in my life. I opened the banking app on the new phone. I expected a glitch. I expected a 0. Instead, I saw a number that stretched across the screen. 9 figures in the checking account alone. I started laughing. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was a terrifying, jagged sound that made a passing woman cross the street. I didn't buy a Ferrari. I didn't book a flight to Paris. I took a cab to the hospital. It was 10 at night, the start of my shift. I walked into the basement locker room one last time. The air smelled of mildew and industrial soap. I opened my locker and took out my only possessions, a stick of deodorant and the printout of Vanessa on the yacht. I looked at her smiling face for a long minute. Then I folded the paper. I placed my gray uniform on the bench, smoothing out the wrinkles. It was a funeral for Wayne the janitor. I left the locker door open, a metal mouth gaping in the dim light. I walked out past the time clock without punching in. The security guard looked up from his magazine, squinting at my street clothes. "You quitting, Wayne?" he asked, not really caring about the answer. I stopped and looked him in the eye. "I am retiring, Earl." He just snorted. I stepped in the cool night air and dialed the number Sterling had given me. "I need a forensic accounting team," I told the voice on the other end. "And I need the best corporate litigators in the tri-state area." The voice didn't ask why. They just asked for targets. "Victor Holbrook," I said, tasting the name like ash. "And the engineering firm of Bowman and Associates." This wasn't spending money. This was buying ammunition. The anger finally had a budget. I checked into the Four Seasons under my father's middle name. The thread count of the sheets felt alien against my skin. I couldn't sleep. I stood at the window looking at the city skyline, finding the buildings I had helped design. They didn't look like monuments to my failure anymore. They looked like pieces on a chessboard. My phone buzzed. It was Sterling. "We found the first shell company," he said. "Holbrook is sloppy." I smiled. The hunt was on. The conference room at Thornwood Holdings smelled of espresso and expensive fear. My accountants had spent 3 weeks dissecting Victor Holbrook's empire. They laid the autopsy results on the glass table. It wasn't an empire, it was a mirage. Victor had leveraged his assets 3 times over, moving money between shell companies to hide massive liquidity gaps. He was playing a dangerous shell game, betting no one would ever look under the cups. I picked up the red marker. I was finally ready to flip the table. Sterling, my lead attorney, pointed to a flow chart that looked like a tangled headset cord. "He owns 3 construction firms that supply Bowman and Associates," Sterling explained. "But he owns them on paper only. The debt is held by a distressed asset fund." I nodded, remembering how Bowman fired me because of Victor's influence. "Buy the debt," I said. "Then call the loans." Sterling typed on his laptop. The keystrokes sounded like gunshots. "Consider it done, Mr. Thornwood. You now effectively own his entire supply chain." Step 1 was crippling Victor, but step 2 was personal. I needed to speak to Richard Bowman. I dialed the number of the firm I had dedicated 15 years to. The receptionist put me through to his executive line. "Richard Bowman." He answered, his voice confident and oblivious. "Mr. Bowman," I said, keeping my tone flat. "This is Wayne. The engineer you fired 3 months ago, because your golf buddy asked you to." There was a long silence. I could almost hear him blinking in confusion. "Wayne?" he asked, his tone shifting from professional to annoyed. "If this is about the severance package, you need to call HR. I am very busy." The dismissal in his voice used to make me feel small. Now it just made me curious. "I am not calling about severance, Richard. I am calling as the majority shareholder of Thornwood Holdings. We recently acquired the debt of your 3 primary steel suppliers." The silence returned, but this time it was heavy. It was the sound of oxygen leaving a room. "I don't understand," he stammered. "Thornwood. That's the Billionaire estate." I leaned back in my leather chair, watching the city below. "Correct. And as the new owner of your supply chain, I've decided we're pivoting directions. We are freezing all shipments to Bowman and Associates effective immediately." I heard a coffee cup hit a desk. "You can't do that," he whispered. "We have deadlines." "The stadium project," I cut him off. "You had a deadline with me too, Richard. You decided that loyalty was optional." "Wayne, please," he said, the arrogance completely dissolved into panic. "Let's talk about this. I can offer you your job back. Senior partner. Double the salary." I looked at the scar on my hand where the light bulb had sliced me. "I don't need a job, Richard. I have a job. My job is cleaning up trash. And I am looking at your firm's financials, and frankly, it looks like something that needs to be scrubbed." I hung up the phone. I didn't slam it. I just pressed end. Sterling looked up from his screen with a rare grin. "Bowman's stock just dipped 4%. The market smells blood." I didn't smile. Bowman was just a pawn. The king was Victor. "What about the SEC packet?" I asked. Sterling slid a thick manila envelope across the polished wood. "It's ready. Evidence of insider trading, tax evasion, and wire fraud. If we send this to the federal prosecutor, it's not just bankruptcy. It's 15 to 20 years in federal prison." The envelope felt heavy in my hand. This was the moral line. Bankrupting a man is business. Putting him in a cage is warfare. I thought about the text message. "Enjoy poverty." I thought about Vanessa on the yacht. drinking champagne bought with stolen money. Victor hadn't just beaten me. He had tried to erase me. He had used his power to starve me out. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for every person he had stepped on to get that yacht. Send it, I said. Send it all. The fallout was faster than I expected. Within 48 hours, the news broke. Federal agents raided Victor's offices in downtown Philadelphia. Cameras caught him being led out in handcuffs, shielding his face with a jacket. His assets were frozen. The yacht was seized in the Caribbean. I watched it all on the giant monitor in my boardroom. It looked like a movie. But the tragedy was real. He had destroyed lives to build a kingdom of sand, and now the tide had finally come in. I turned off the television. The room went silent. I expected to feel triumphant, like a hero in a Greek myth standing over a slain monster. Instead, I just felt tired. The vengeance was complete, but it didn't heal the cut on my hand or bring back the years I wasted trusting the wrong people. Sterling started packing up his files. "What now, Mr. Thornwood?" he asked. I looked at the blank screen. "Now," I said quietly. "We simply wait for the phone to ring." The collapse of Victor's world was less of a landslide and more of a controlled demolition. The federal freeze on his assets meant the credit cards stopped working immediately. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that Vanessa was stranded in St. Slept Bart's for 3 days before she could scrape together cash for a coach flight home. She arrived at Philadelphia International with 2 Louis Vuitton suitcases and absolutely nowhere to go. The penthouse was sealed with yellow tape. Her fairy tale had turned into a police procedural. Reality hit hard. I was sitting in my new study, a room lined with walnut bookshelves and heavy silence. My phone buzzed on the mahogany desk, vibrating against the wood. I didn't need to look to know who it was. The timing was simply too perfect. I picked it up and saw her name. Not wife. Not Vanessa. Just the number I hadn't deleted yet. "Wayne, I saw the news. I am so confused and scared. Can we please talk? I think I made a mistake." The audacity was almost impressive. I read the text again, dissecting the words like a structural failure analysis. She didn't say she missed me. She said she was scared. She was drowning in consequences, and she remembered I used to be a strong swimmer. She didn't know I was a Thornwood yet. The press hadn't leaked my name. Only that Victor was taken down by an anonymous tip. She just knew I was stable. She wanted to return to the safety of the man she mocked. It was insulting, yet pitifully predictable. My thumbs hovered over the glass screen. The temptation to reply was a physical itch. I desperately wanted to scratch. I wanted to type, "Enjoy poverty." I wanted to send her a screenshot of my bank balance. I wanted to tell her that the man she called a loser just bought the building she used to live in. Rage is a powerful fuel, but it burns dirty. If I engaged, I was still playing her game. I was still the husband trying to prove his worth. I realized that hate is not the opposite of love. Indifference is. If I screamed at her, she would know she still mattered. She would know she still had the power to wreck my afternoon. But silence. Silence is a void. Silence tells her that she doesn't exist in my world anymore. She was a ghost haunting a house I had already sold. I didn't need to exorcise her. I just needed to change the locks. The power dynamic shifted permanently in that quiet, dim room. I pressed the block button on the touchscreen. There was no fanfare, no dramatic music. Just a small digital confirmation that she was gone. It felt less like a victory, and more like setting down a heavy backpack I had been carrying for 15 years. She would call again. She would try to find me. But she would only find a digital wall, I placed the phone face down on the desk. The silence in the room changed. It wasn't lonely anymore. It was finally peaceful. I left the study and walked to the kitchen where the architect was waiting. We weren't discussing skyscrapers or casinos. We were looking at blueprints for a cottage in Valley Forge. My mother needs a garden, I told him, tracing the line of the patio with my finger. And no stairs. Everything on one level. He nodded, making notes. This was the first time I was building something for love, not for a paycheck or a portfolio. It felt like the first honest engineering I had ever done. The next morning, I drove to Philadelphia General. I didn't park in the employee lot this time. I parked my rental in the donor circle. Dr. Thorne met me in the lobby, looking exhausted but smiling. "You didn't have to come, Wayne," he said. I handed him a check that made his eyes widen behind his wire glasses. "It's for the nursing wing," I said. "Name it after Dorothy Wayne. And give the janitorial staff a raise. A real one." He shook my hand, completely speechless. That evening, the story finally broke. The news channels connected the dots between the Thornwood hair and the anonymous whistleblower. My face was on the screen, a grainy photo from my old ID badge. I imagined Vanessa sitting in a motel room somewhere, watching the television. I imagined the moment she realized that the man she discarded for being ambitionless was now one of the wealthiest men in Pennsylvania. That realization would be her prison. She would live in that regret forever. It was a sufficient sentence. I poured a glass of water and walked out to the balcony. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a grid of electricity and concrete. I used to think my value was tied to those buildings, to the corporate ladder I tried to climb. But standing there in the dark, I realized I didn't need the view from the top to be whole. I just needed to be clean. The mop bucket was gone, but the lesson remained. I took a sip, finally tasting the freedom. It had been a year since I traded the mop bucket for a board seat. The smell of pot roast grounded me as I sat on the patio of the cottage in Valley Forge. My mother was pruning her hydrangeas, wearing a sun hat that cost more than our old rent. She looked up and smiled, a genuine expression free of the worry that used to etch deep lines around her eyes. "Dinner in 10, Wayne," she called out. The peace here was physical. It felt like breathing pure oxygen after holding my breath for decades. The next day, I met Russell Thorne at the hospital cafeteria. He was the chief of emergency medicine. Now a promotion he earned through skill, not my donations. We walked past the new Dorothy Wayne wing. Students in crisp white coats rushed by, learning to save lives in a building my blood money built. Russell slept and pointed to a bronze plaque on the wall. "We saved 3 cardiac patients here yesterday," he said, adjusting his glasses. I looked at the polished glass. "You saved them, Russ." "I just wrote the check." He shook his head. Driving home, I passed the skyline I used to worship. The steel and glass towers seemed smaller now, less imposing against the gray sky. For years, I believed I was worthless because I lost my status. I thought my value was printed on a business card or a bank statement. But the money didn't make me a man. The nights spent scrubbing toilets while invisible to the world did that. The billions in the bank were just resources. The resilience I forged in the dark was the actual asset. I wasn't proud of the cash. I never heard from Vanessa again, after blocking her number. Rumor had it she moved to Ohio to live with her sister, returning to the ordinary life she despised. Victor was serving his sentence in a federal facility in Jersey. They were footnotes now, cautionary tales about the cost of greed. I didn't hate them anymore. Hate takes energy, and I had better things to do. I pulled into the driveway of my modest four-bedroom house. It wasn't a mansion, but it was a home. The difference was subtle, but it meant everything to me. Inside my study, the mahogany desk was covered in foundation grant applications. I sat down and opened the bottom drawer. Tucked in the back, behind a box of expensive fountain pens, was a small piece of gray plastic. It was my old name tag. The letters were faded, scratched from months of friction against mop handles. It smelled faintly of bleach and desperation. I ran my thumb over the name Wayne. It was a sharp reminder of the man who kept showing up when the world told him to quit. That man was stronger than any billionaire. I closed the drawer and picked up a pen to sign the next grant. My hand still had a faint white scar across the palm, where the light bulb sliced me open. It wasn't a mark of shame. It was a lifeline. It was the crack that let the light in. My father never knew he was a Thornwood, but he raised me to survive the storm. I signed the paper with a steady hand. My blood might have made me a billionaire, but the mop made me who I am. The story was finally mine.